An old cat sits in front of a door, unmoving. Inside, a sick puppy lies barely breathing. And behind the door, a woman who hasn't spoken to anyone in years. Why is a stray cat leading a dog to someone who's given up on the world? What secret connects them all? And how did this forgotten porch become the place where three broken lives would begin to heal? Watch till the end. This story will change how you see hope. Oren moved like smoke through the overgrown hedges behind the Willow Fern Fish Market, his black and white coat slick from the mist that clung to the early evening air. He was lean, almost gaunt, with angular hips and shoulders that spoke of years spent scraping by on scraps and instinct. His yellow-green eyes, sharp as glass shards, held a feral intelligence. Oren was not a house cat. He was no one's pet. His world was alleyways and gutters, storm drains and broken fences. He trusted no one, relied on nothing except the rhythm of hunger and survival. It was a Sunday evening, and the park bordering the city center still smelled faintly of grilled meat and burnt marshmallows. A local youth group had held a camp out there the night before. Sleeping bags scattered like forgotten memories, soda cans crushed beneath grass, and laughter that had long since evaporated. Oren prowled the edge of the park, nose twitching at the scent of stale hot dogs and dropped fries. But what he heard next stopped him in his tracks. A sound, weak, muffled, trembling, rose from beyond the brambles. A whimper. Not the bark of aggression or the howl of defiance, but the trembling cry of something afraid or dying. Oren froze, tail still. His ears twitched toward the sound. He didn't like this. Whimpering things were usually trouble. Dying things were often contagious, but the sound persisted, thin and broken, pulling at something beneath the cold armor he had worn since kittenhood. He moved closer. Beyond a thicket of thorn bushes, hidden beneath damp leaves and cigarette butts, lay a puppy. The creature was pitiful. A German shepherd, or some version of one, though it was hard to tell through the mud and tangled fur. He couldn't have been older than 4 months. His once bold markings, that black saddle over a tan coat, were dulled with dirt and streaked with blood where thorns had torn into his legs. His body was twisted in a nest of brambles, and every attempt to move only made the thorns tighten. His eyes locked onto Oren's, wide, wild, desperate. Oren could have walked away. He almost did. But something in the puppy's eyes gave him pause. Not just the pain, but the silence beneath it. A silent plea. Oren knew that silence. It had once lived in his own ribs, tucked between bone and breath, when he was abandoned in a grocery parking lot years ago. He stepped closer. The puppy whimpered louder, struggling. "Stop," Oren hissed under his breath, though the creature couldn't understand. Still, the puppy froze. Good. Smart. Oren circled, sniffing. No humans. No scent of recent food or water. Just this one broken body in a heap of thorns, left behind like trash. Carefully, Oren raised a paw and pressed down one of the vines. It recoiled slightly under his weight. He repeated the motion, testing, calculating. With a mix of claw and paw, he began to pull at the brambles. The puppy yelped but did not bite. Oren worked for several minutes, until the pup finally slipped free and collapsed on the wet grass. The dog licked Oren's paw, a soft, tentative motion. Oren recoiled, fur bristling. He wasn't ready for gratitude. From the other side of the park, tucked behind a tree with his sketchbook pressed to his knees, a boy watched. Liam Torres, 11 years old, slim, pale, and quiet, had escaped the noise of home to find peace in the park with his pencils. His messy brown hair fell over eyes too serious for his age. His parents had divorced the previous winter. Since then, he lived with his grandmother, a well-meaning woman who talked too much about soap operas and not enough about the storm in his chest. He had been sketching trees until he saw the cat. Liam squinted through the branches, watching as the black and white cat dragged a muddy bundle from the brambles. His heart quickened when he saw it was a puppy. A real one. And the cat. No, this wasn't a random moment of luck. The cat had known. It had helped. Liam turned the page in his sketchbook and began to draw furiously. He titled the page, "The Black and Tan." The pencil lines curved into the image of a feline guardian, eyes narrowed, standing over a limp puppy. By the time he looked up again, both animals were gone. He walked home slowly, holding the sketchbook against his chest like something sacred. At home, he showed it to his grandmother. She nodded absently, spooning soup into a chipped bowl. "That's nice, sweetheart," she murmured. "Just don't get your hopes up. Stray animals don't make happy stories." Liam didn't respond. He didn't argue. But that night, he drew another picture. This time, the puppy was standing, the cat behind him. They were walking side by side under rain. He called it Rescue in Silence. Meanwhile, in the park's convenience store, a conversation unfolded behind the counter. A grizzled man in a brown postal jacket leaned over a coffee machine. "Strangest thing," said Hank Delaney, the neighborhood's semi-retired mailman, known for his memory and his endless supply of local gossip. "Last night, I saw a group of teens camping out back here. Loud, rowdy, music blaring. But this morning, just trash, and a weird little duffel bag by the dumpster, torn open." The cashier raised an eyebrow. "What kind of weird?" "Like something had been in it, alive." Hank sipped his black coffee, lips tight. "You think they left the pup?" "Wouldn't be the first time," he muttered, eyes narrowing. Outside the shop window, the street lamps buzzed. Rain had washed the sidewalks clean, but the truth, like muddy paw prints, had a way of staying behind. And somewhere, several blocks away, a cat with tired paws and a muddy tail led a trembling, limping pup down a dark alley, searching for something he had never looked for before: help. Rain fell in steady sheets, turning the alleyways of willow fern into slick, glistening rivers of runoff. Oren's paws splashed through shallow puddles as he led the limping pup beside him through the city's outer blocks. The pup, now named Theo only in Oren's mind, stumbled with every few steps. His thin legs barely held him upright, and his breath came in soft, shivering puffs. Oren didn't slow his pace, not because he didn't care, but because he knew that stopping would mean freezing, and freezing meant dying. Theo had grown quieter since leaving the bramble patch. Perhaps the rain had drained the last of his energy, or perhaps he was simply resigned. His ears drooped low, and his tail hung limp between his legs. But even in his broken state, he continued to follow, eyes locked on Oren, trusting the one creature who had not walked away. The streetlights blinked weakly overhead, struggling against the storm. The city's hum had dulled under the curtain of rain. Storefronts were closed, sidewalks empty. A rare silence for a Sunday night. Oren, soaked and shivering, kept to the shadows, his feline senses honed from years of avoiding feet and fists. He knew this part of the city well. If they could just make it 2 more blocks south, there was a stretch of older homes, quiet ones, with bushes to hide in and porches with shelter. But Theo's legs gave out again. Oren paused, glanced back. The puppy had collapsed near the curb, breathing hard, eyes glazed. Oren patted back and gently bumped his head against Theo's cheek. The pup didn't move. A low rumble echoed down the street, wheels slicing through wet asphalt. A car. Oren looked up. The headlights were faint at first, but they brightened rapidly, cutting through the rain like twin knives. The vehicle turned onto the street, its tires hissing. Theo lay directly in its path. Without thinking, Oren bolted into the road. He darted in front of the car, arching his back, fur bristling, eyes glowing like embers. He let out a screech. Not a meow, not a hiss, but something guttural and wild. The car skidded to a halt, the tires screeching in protest, water sprang up in arcs. Inside the vehicle, a man gripped the wheel, wide-eyed. He was in his mid-50s with short steel-gray hair and a weathered face. His name was Raymond Cho, a former long-haul trucker now working late-night food deliveries around Willowfern. Raymond was a man shaped by the road, stoic, practical, and used to solving problems with his hands. He wore a flannel shirt over a rain-soaked vest, and his eyes, though tired, were alert. He stepped out of the car, shielding his face from the downpour, and squinted at the scene. A cat stood in front of his bumper, soaked to the skin, its eyes unblinking. A few feet away, a puppy lay sprawled on the edge of the road, unmoving. Raymond hesitated. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping forward. Oren didn't run. He simply turned and trotted to Theo's side, then looked back at the man. Something in the gesture struck Raymond harder than it should have. He crouched beside the puppy. "Easy, boy," he murmured, touching the pup's side. Theo stirred faintly. Raymond looked around. No people. No tags. No sign of an owner. Just a dying dog and a cat that refused to leave him. He wasn't the type to get involved, but something in the way the cat guarded the pup, like a soldier standing over a fallen comrade, compelled him. Raymond lifted Theo carefully and placed him on the sidewalk. Then he looked at the cat again. "You got him this far, huh?" he said softly. "Damn." He returned to his car, started the engine, and drove off slowly, glancing at the rearview mirror as he disappeared down the street. Oren didn't move for several seconds. When the roar of the engine faded, he curled around Theo's body, shielding him from the wind. On the other side of the city, in a modest apartment above a bakery, Liam Torres sat on his bed, with a sketch pad across his lap. The light from the hallway cast a faint orange glow on the pages. Rain thudded against the window pane, but he wasn't paying attention. His mind was elsewhere. He had gone to the park again that evening, just before the storm broke, hoping desperately to see the cat again. He'd brought a piece of cheese and foil, sat on the same bench, waited. But Oren hadn't come. Liam didn't tell his grandmother where he'd gone. He just left quietly, as usual. When he returned, soaked through and empty-handed, she only glanced up from her show and tossed him a towel. Now he stared at the blank page in his lap, his pencil trembling in his fingers. He drew the tree where he'd first seen Oren, then the space beneath it. Empty. Hollow. He titled the page, "Missing." Back on the sidewalk near Maple Crescent, Oren sat awake as the rain eased. His tail was curled tight, his ears flat, but his eyes remained sharp. Theo shivered once, then pressed against him. Oren didn't pull away. A thought came to him, not in words, but an instinct. They couldn't stay there. Theo wouldn't last another night like this. Oren needed to find shelter. He scanned the street. Across from them stood a row of houses, all dark, all quiet, except for one. A porch light flickered behind ivy-covered rails. A motion sensor had likely been triggered. There was a scent on the wind. Warmth, old wood, and something faintly familiar. Milk. Tuna. It was the house where, months ago, someone had left out a bowl for him. Oren narrowed his eyes. He nudged Theo. The pup stirred weakly. Not much, but enough. Oren stood and began to limp toward the house, pausing every few steps. Theo followed, dragging one paw slightly, but still moving. Together they reached the front steps. The house belonged to Evelyn Marlowe, a retired veterinarian in her early 70s. Though no one called her doctor anymore, she was tall, with fine white hair she always tied into a low twist, and a face lined with years of grief and silence. Since her husband's passing and her son's sudden death in an accident 5 years ago, she had spoken little, smiled less, and lived mostly behind drawn curtains and quiet routines. That night, she sat in her armchair by the window, sipping tea, watching the storm retreat. She thought she heard something, light scratching, perhaps a cat pawing at the door. She stood slowly, placed the cup on its saucer, and moved to the front. When she opened the door, the porch light illuminated two creatures. A black and white cat, fur-matted, stood in front. Beside him, barely standing, was a trembling German shepherd puppy, coated in mud, eyes wide with something between terror and surrender. Evelyn inhaled sharply, but her voice remained calm. "Well," she whispered, "what in heaven's name have you two been through?" As she stepped forward, the cat didn't flinch, and for the first time in years, Evelyn Marlowe left her door wide open. The rain had stopped by the time Evelyn Marlowe stood on her porch, one hand on the door frame, the other resting lightly over her chest. The air was heavy with petrichor and something else, something fragile and alive. Before her stood the soaked and shivering figures of a black and white cat and a mud-smeared German shepherd puppy. The puppy's legs trembled so violently that he looked more like a shadow of a dog than a real one. The cat sat poised beside him, chest slightly puffed, as if daring the night to challenge their presence. Evelyn Marlowe was not easily startled. 73 years had carved patience into her like the slow, deep grooves on a violin. She was tall for a woman of her generation, with an angular frame that had grown more delicate with age. Her silver hair was always twisted into a loose bun at the nape of her neck, and she wore her late husband's wool cardigan almost religiously, despite its worn sleeves and faint smell of pipe tobacco. Her pale blue eyes were calm but distant, the eyes of someone who had buried too many people and too many dreams. She hadn't let anyone in, not really, since the accident that took her son. And yet, As she looked down at the trembling puppy and the stray cat who seemed to have summoned him like some mythical messenger, she didn't hesitate. Her mind didn't flood with questions. Her body moved on instinct. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside. The cat didn't move. He blinked once, his expression unreadable. The puppy stumbled forward instead, his legs giving out once he crossed the threshold. He collapsed on the rug, too tired to even lift his head. Evelyn closed the door. Inside the house, the air was warm, carrying the scent of lavender, old books, and a hint of chamomile from the tea Evelyn had abandoned in the living room. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with photographs, antique clocks, and dusty veterinary textbooks. A painting above the fireplace showed a boy with wind-blown hair holding a German shepherd by the lake. Evelyn never looked at it directly anymore, but tonight, it drew her eyes. She knelt beside the puppy, her knees cracking softly. "You poor thing," she murmured, brushing aside the clumps of matted fur around his ears. "Who left you like this?" She fetched a towel, warm water, and a plastic basin. Over the next hour, she worked in silence. She removed twigs, burrs, and dried blood. She found 2 ticks and a nasty scrape on his left hind leg. She spoke only occasionally, more to herself than to him. "You're lucky your friend brought you here." She looked toward the door. The cat, still unnamed, still unmoving, was sitting on the porch, his tail curled around his paws, eyes narrowed in silent observation. He made no attempt to enter, but he didn't leave either. Evelyn left the door open an inch. The puppy's breathing steadied as the warm towel pressed into his side. When she touched his paw, he gave a soft whimper, but did not pull away. "Well," she said, sighing as she stroked his head, "I suppose you'll need a name." She thought for a moment. "Theo," she said finally. "You look like a Theo." The puppy didn't respond, but the name settled in the room like dust catching sunlight. "And as for you," she turned to the doorway, "you've clearly earned one too." The cat tilted his head slightly. "Oren," she said, "it means light from the edge of the forest." As if in subtle agreement, Oren blinked slowly. Meanwhile, across the street, a figure peered from behind the blinds of a dim apartment window. Hank Delaney, Willow Fern's mailman emeritus, squinted through his fogged glasses, sipping from a dented thermos. His wiry frame leaned against the window frame, and his snow-white eyebrows furrowed with curiosity. He had seen a lot in his 35 years of walking this neighborhood. Marriages, deaths, ugly divorces, surprise pregnancies. But he had never seen anything quite like this. A cat dragging a puppy to Evelyn Marlowe's front steps? That was the kind of thing old folks whispered about in diners, embellishing each time until the story turned mythic. Hank scratched his chin. "Damn strange," he muttered. The next morning he'd make sure to mention it at the neighborhood committee meeting, not out of nosiness, but because he believed stories like that needed telling. They had weight. They made people stop and listen. Back inside, Evelyn moved slowly through the kitchen, preparing a soft meal. Chicken and white rice, the kind she used to make for her own patients back when she still had a practice. She placed it in a shallow bowl and set it before Theo, who stirred at the scent, lifted his head with effort, and began to eat. "You've got some strength in you," she said, half smiling. Later that night, Evelyn sat in her armchair by the fire, legs covered with a knitted blanket. Theo lay curled on a small cushion near the hearth, his breathing steady. His tail flicked slightly in his sleep. The soft crackle of the fire and the steady rain outside made the house feel fuller than it had in years. Oren still hadn't come in. He remained on the porch, unmoving, like a statue carved from storm and silence. Evelyn rose, took another blanket, and laid it just inside the door. Then she walked away, leaving the door ajar. Somewhere past midnight, Oren stepped inside. He did not make a sound. Evelyn didn't look up. She only whispered, "Good." Later, in her bedroom, she sat at the edge of the bed, fingers resting lightly on a photograph kept in a small wooden frame. Her son, 19 years old, grinning beside a German shepherd named Bramble. The last photo ever taken before the accident. Her boy had always said, "Dogs see you even when no one else does." She closed her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, that night she had been seen, and maybe she wasn't the only one. Morning arrived gently over Willow Fern, casting gold-tinged light through the slatted blinds of Evelyn Marlowe's kitchen. The rain had lifted during the night, leaving behind dew-covered sidewalks and a sky the color of powdered ash. Inside her home, quiet persisted. Thick, but not heavy. It was the kind of quiet that came not from absence, but from peace beginning to root itself after years of drought. Evelyn stood at her kitchen sink, hands moving automatically as she rinsed a damp washcloth and wrung it out with practiced care. Her gray cardigan hung loose over a navy blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Age had narrowed her shoulders and etched time into the soft folds of her neck, but her movements carried a precision she hadn't used in years. She approached the dog bed by the fireplace, where the young German shepherd, now properly known as Theo, lay curled into a loose ball. His eyes fluttered open, still glassy with exhaustion, but brighter than the night before. She knelt beside him, placing the cool cloth against his ear. He winced, a soft yelp slipping from his mouth. Evelyn's touch softened. "Still warm," she muttered, "but down from yesterday." She examined his belly and flanks more thoroughly now that the pup had regained some strength. His coat was still ragged, though cleaner, and under the scrapes and bruises, she found several ticks buried deep near the nape of his neck. She clicked her tongue with a mix of concern and familiarity. "You poor baby. It's a wonder you're still walking at all." She reached for a small metal kit, cracked it open, and began the slow work of tick removal, using tweezers and antiseptic with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. In her younger years, Evelyn had run a modest veterinary practice on Main Street. She had retired a decade ago after her husband died and her son left home. When the accident happened, there was nothing left of her to offer. She'd packed her stethoscope in a shoebox and closed the clinic without saying goodbye to a single patient. And now, here she was again, on her knees, coaxing healing into a creature too young to understand why he had been hurt. Outside, the porch creaked. Evelyn's head turned. Oren was there again. The black and white cat stood just past the mat, eyes steady, body still. He made no sound, no movement toward the door, just watched. His posture held a soldier's poise, noble and alert. But there was fatigue behind it too, and wariness that didn't soften easily. Evelyn rose, moved to the linen cabinet, and returned with a folded quilt, one of her husband's old ones, thick and faded with time. She placed it just inside the door, where warmth met the edge of shadow, and walked away without a word. When she looked again 15 minutes later, Oren had taken his place on the fabric, his tail tucked neatly around his legs. He did not sleep, but he did not leave. Back in her bedroom, Evelyn made a call to the local veterinary supply outlet. She ordered worm medication, antibiotic ointment, and 2 small bags of specialized puppy food. "Are you back in business, Dr. Marlowe?" the voice on the other end teased. Evelyn smiled faintly. "No, just helping someone who walked in unannounced." As the sun rose higher, a boy across town prepared for school. Liam Torres sat at the edge of his bed, tugging on a hoodie one size too big. His hair was messy as usual, his backpack hanging limp at one shoulder. But there was something new tucked under his arm, a drawing, folded carefully in a protective sleeve. The drawing, titled "The Waiting One," depicted a cat sitting before a door just cracked open, framed by lamplight and storm. It was detailed, startlingly so for a boy his age. The tension in the cat's shoulders, the gleam of water along the wood floor, the echo of loneliness cloaked in stillness. It had taken him 3 nights to finish. He brought it to school that day, sliding it into the art class inbox with trembling fingers. That afternoon, as the bell rang and students spilled into hallways like scattered marbles, Liam was asked to stay behind. His art teacher, Mrs. Klein, was a tall woman in her 40s with thick black glasses and long curly hair she rarely tamed. She held the drawing in one hand and looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "Liam," she said, "this is real. Do you know what I mean by that?" He hesitated. "I guess. I don't mean technically correct, although it is. I mean it feels like something you lived. That cat, it's not just a subject, it's part of you." He stared at the floor, unsure what to say. She handed it back. "Don't stop drawing. I think this is something you're good at. Really good at." For the first time in months, Liam allowed himself to smile, small, uncertain, but genuine. That evening, back in Evelyn's living room, Theo took slow, wobbly steps to the kitchen doorway. Evelyn, washing dishes, turned at the sound of his paws on tile. "You're a brave one," she said, drying her hands. "Come on, let's try some broth." She ladled a warm mix into a bowl and set it down. Theo sniffed, tail wagging slightly. From the entryway, Oren watched with a flick of his tail. He had not touched the kibble Evelyn had left out earlier. He was still a creature of back alleys and fishbone scraps. But the warmth, the shelter, it was starting to wear down his edges. That night, after Evelyn had retired to bed with a book she never really read, the local news ran a short segment. The anchorwoman, neat and composed in a blue blazer, spoke gravely. Willow Fern residents have raised concern as local shelters report a sharp increase in abandoned dogs, particularly in and around city parks. Several incidents have involved puppies too young to survive alone. Authorities are urging the public to report suspicious activity. Evelyn watched from her armchair, the light from the TV flickering over her thoughtful face. She leaned over, picked up the phone, and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "This is Dr. Marlowe," she said when the shelter receptionist answered. "I can take one, maybe two, temporarily, until you find proper placements." Her voice was calm, resolute. After hanging up, she looked over at the two animals curled on opposite ends of the hearth. Theo asleep on the bed of towels, Oren on the folded quilt. The fire was low, but steady. For the first time in years, Evelyn left the bedroom door cracked open. Outside, the city breathed, and in the quiet of that modest home at the end of a forgotten street, hope took root where it hadn't dared to grow before. Chapter 5. When the Past Came Knocking. The night was quiet in Willow Fern, the kind of stillness that came only after several days of storm. The wind had finally settled, the trees stood motionless, and even the streetlights seemed to glow a little softer. In the modest house at the end of Lavender Street, Evelyn Marlowe stirred in her sleep. Her breathing, usually deep and even, caught slightly as a dream began to take hold. In the dream, she stood on the same porch she had stepped onto just days before. But it wasn't raining. The sun was high, the sky clear, and a warm breeze tugged gently at her gray hair. Standing on the sidewalk was her son, Michael, young and radiant as she remembered him best. He wore his faded university hoodie, sleeves rolled, hands gripping a leash. At the other end of the leash stood Bramble, his old German shepherd, tongue lolling, eyes bright. Michael smiled at her. It wasn't the ghost smile of her grief, but a real one, warm, cheeky, whole. "Mom," he said, "you're not alone anymore." Evelyn jolted awake. The room was dim, the edges of the dream already beginning to blur, but the echo of her son's voice remained. She sat on the edge of her bed, one hand still clutching the hem of her blanket. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. She hadn't cried in years, not since the funeral, not even when she shut the doors of her clinic for good. Down the hall, she could hear Theo shifting in his bed and the faint creak of Oren repositioning himself on the quilt by the door. That morning, Evelyn didn't go straight to the kitchen. Instead, she opened the door to the small, cluttered room at the back of the house. It had once been Michael's bedroom, and later, a storage space for forgotten boxes, broken furniture, and unused holiday decorations. Dust hung thick in the air. Old books, faded cushions, a toppled lamp, and a scratched dresser were crammed wall to wall. She stood in the doorway a moment, breathing it in, then rolled up her sleeves. Evelyn spent the next 3 hours clearing space. She moved slowly but with intent. Each item she touched seemed to carry a memory, some sharp, others dulled by time. She stacked old cardboard boxes by the hallway, dusted the window frame, and pushed the dresser against the wall. When she uncovered the floor tiles, she smiled slightly. "This'll do." By midday, the room had been transformed into something else entirely. She laid out a folded dog bed in one corner, placed an old ceramic bowl in another, and added a folded towel for Oren near the windowsill. In the closet, she placed the supplies she'd ordered: antibiotics, shampoo, brushes, gauze. The room wasn't a clinic. It wasn't Michael's anymore either. It was something new. Meanwhile, across town, Liam Torres sat alone at the edge of the school playground, his hands clenched into tight fists buried deep in his jacket pockets. A bruise was blooming beneath his left eye, and the edge of his lip had split, now swollen and raw. The fight had been brief and messy. One of the boys, Jack or Travis, he couldn't remember, had grabbed his sketch pad during recess, flipping through the pages with mock commentary. "Look at this one," the boy had sneered. "What's this supposed to be? Cat cuddling a dog? What kind of baby nonsense is this?" Liam had tried to grab it back, and fists had flown. No one had said anything when the teacher pulled them apart. No one ever did. Now, sitting beneath the lone pine tree at the edge of the lot, Liam stared out at the road, his heart burning with something he couldn't quite name. Shame, maybe. Or the ache of trying to be something and being mocked for it. After school, he didn't go home. He walked instead, hands jammed deep into his hoodie, shoulders hunched against the wind. The streets blurred by in slow rhythm until he reached the familiar turn on Lavender Street. He didn't knock, didn't walk up the driveway. He just stood by the old wooden fence, peering through the slats. Inside the yard, Theo was lounging in a patch of afternoon sun, one paw twitching as he dreamed. Oren sat nearby, perched on the edge of a flower bed, like a silent sentinel, tail curled, head held high. Liam watched them for a long time, a thin line of dried blood on his lip catching the light. He didn't move until Evelyn stepped outside, a pair of gloves in her hand, carrying a shallow water dish. She noticed the figure by the fence almost immediately. Her eyes softened. She didn't speak. She just nodded once. Liam didn't wave. But he didn't run either. Back inside, Evelyn picked up a notebook she had begun earlier that week. A spiral-bound journal with worn edges and a cover that read, Pet Health and Recovery. She flipped to the most recent entry. Patient, Theo, breed, German Shepherd, juvenile, approx, age, 4 months, weight gain, +2, 6 pounds since intake. Notes. Appetite improving, energy returning. Still showing signs of joint stiffness, tolerates cleaning. Trust forming. Behavioral. Sleeps through night. Follows Evelyn around house. Tail movement suggests cautious optimism. She added a line beneath it. Emotionally, starting to feel like he belongs. Satisfied, she closed the book, took a photo of the entry with her old phone, and posted it in the Willowfern Pet Rescue group online, a small forum of retired vets, fosterers, and rescue workers who shared notes and updates. Within hours, her post had 57 comments. So glad to see Theo thriving. You've still got the touch, Dr. M. We missed your updates. Thank you for sharing this. This gives me hope today. Evelyn scrolled through the messages slowly, her fingers resting lightly on the screen. It had been years since her words reached anyone beyond the walls of her house. Years since anyone thanked her for saving something. She looked up. Theo had ambled into the room and collapsed at her feet, tail thumping once before falling still. Oren watched from the threshold. I guess we're all healing a little, she whispered. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it carried warmth. The warmth of a community waking up, of a boy standing by a fence, of memories returning not to haunt, but to hold gently. And Evelyn, for the first time in over a decade, left the light on in the back room, because she knew tomorrow she'd need it again. The wind howled through the trees that night, whispering warnings through the loose eaves of Evelyn Marlowe's old home. The sky over Willowfern was cloudless, but brittle with cold, the kind of cold that slipped beneath windowsills and settled deep into bones. Inside, the fire had long since burned low, and the house had quieted into the kind of hush that comes only when all its inhabitants are asleep. Theo lay curled on his bed of folded blankets, his breathing shallow but even. Oren was perched nearby, as he often was now, his front paws tucked beneath his chest, tail draped like a banner along the floorboards. Evelyn had gone to bed early that night, tired but content, after another long day of tending to the pup's recovery. She had added a final note in her journal. Theo ate full portion. Wagged tail when I whistled. Progress feels real. But just before midnight, Oren stirred. He was not a cat prone to false alarms. His ears twitched, his pupils narrowed, and he stood abruptly. Something was wrong. Theo's breathing had shifted. His flank rose unevenly, and small tremors ran along his legs. Oren moved closer and sniffed the pup's muzzle. It was hot. Far too hot. A low whimper escaped Theo's throat as his legs kicked out involuntarily. His body jerked, then stiffened. The warmth turned into searing heat against Oren's fur. Theo was burning up. Oren bolted down the hall. He clawed at Evelyn's door, letting out a piercing yowl. Not his usual sound, not even feline in tone, but something raw, primal, urgent. Inside, Evelyn jolted upright, her pulse racing. She'd lived with silence so long, this sound felt like an alarm from another world. She swung the door open, hair loose from sleep, robe half fastened. Oren didn't wait. He turned and sprinted back down the hall, pausing only to glance over his shoulder. She followed. When she reached the living room, Evelyn fell to her knees beside Theo's bed. His body was shaking violently now, eyes rolled back, foam at the corners of his mouth. His legs were stiff, splayed out, tail twitching uncontrollably. "No, no, no," she whispered, hands already moving. Her old veterinary bag was still stored in the closet in the back room she'd cleaned just days ago. Within seconds, she retrieved it, her fingers shaking only slightly, and opened the zippered pouch. Inside was the emergency kit. A sterile syringe, a vial of antipyretic, gloves, saline. She filled the syringe with practiced efficiency, brushed back Theo's fur, and found the loose skin at his scruff. "I've got you, baby," she said, breathless. "I've got you." She injected the medicine, then used a cloth to dab cool water across his paws and ears. She opened his mouth gently and checked his tongue. It was red, dry. Classic signs of a febrile seizure. Her hands worked with the muscle memory of a former life, while her chest ached with something far less clinical. "Not you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I'm not losing you." As the tremors began to ease, and Theo's body slowly slumped back into stillness, Evelyn knelt beside him, one hand on his chest, counting heartbeats. Still there, still fighting. Oren sat a few feet away, fur puffed from adrenaline, his yellow eyes never blinking. His body was ready to spring again if needed. But for now, he waited. Evelyn leaned down, her voice breaking with tenderness. "You're the reason I got out of bed this week," she said. "The reason I smiled for no damn reason. The reason I'm not just a woman waiting for the end." Her voice trembled. "You're the reason I want to live." That morning, just as the sun crawled over the rooftops and painted streaks of gold across the floor, a soft knock came at the front door. Evelyn, bleary-eyed and wrapped in her cardigan, opened it slowly. Liam stood there, clutching something in both hands. His usual hoodie was zipped to the chin, his hair still damp from the walk. His eyes looked tired, but they brightened when she opened the door. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi, sweetheart," Evelyn replied, surprised but not unpleasantly. "You're up early." "I wanted to bring you this." He held up a wooden frame. Inside was a drawing, one of his best yet. It showed Theo lying on the floor, his body surrounded by shadows shaped like fangs and claws. But standing between him and the darkness was a cat. Oren, drawn with striking detail, his fur bristled, his tail arched high. The title scrawled across the bottom in tiny block letters, "Fighting the Darkness." Evelyn took it gently, studying every line, every brush of graphite and ink. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and true." Liam looked down, unsure of what to say. Before he could retreat, Evelyn reached out and pulled him into a hug, a real one, warm and slightly trembling. "You," she murmured, "are the first person who brought light back into this house. Don't you forget that." Liam blinked hard, then nodded into her shoulder. Later that day, Evelyn sat at her desk and wrote in her journal again, this time with more than medical notes. She described the night in full, the symptoms, the treatment, the miracle of Oren's alarm. Then, on a whim, she took a photo of the entry and Theo curled up beside Oren, who was grooming one paw with the air of a king who had just saved a kingdom. She posted it to the Willowfern Pet Rescue Group with the caption, "Theo survived a seizure last night. Oren saved his life. I'm only the hands. They're the soul." She thought nothing more of it. But somewhere in the vast jungle of the internet, a woman named Rita Danvers, a rescue coordinator and social media volunteer for a statewide animal advocacy group, saw the post and quietly shared it to her organization's Twitter account. An old vet, a stray cat, and a puppy who fought the dark together. We could all use this kind of story today. #RescueLove. Within hours, the post exploded. People shared it with captions like, "This made me cry in the best way. A cat saved a dog, but also saved a human. My faith in the world is slightly restored. Where can I donate?" This woman is a saint. Evelyn wasn't aware of any of it until later that night, when her phone buzzed so much she thought it had malfunctioned. Messages, comments, interview requests. She smiled softly, setting the phone down without responding. Instead, she turned to Theo, who lay sleeping beside the fire, and Oren, who was now curled beneath the armchair. The world might want their story, but for now, it belonged only to them. And tonight, unlike so many nights before, Evelyn left every light in the living room on. Chapter 7: When the City Listened. By the time Evelyn Marlowe stepped out onto her porch that morning, the street in front of her home no longer belonged to just the quiet footfalls of the postman or the hush of neighborhood birds. 2 vans were parked along the curb, white with logos splashed across their sides: Willow Fern Community News and Channel 14 Local Morning. Cameras already being set up, microphones clipped to jackets, voices humming through earpieces. She adjusted the collar of her gray wool cardigan and looked down at her feet where Orrin sat, tail curled neatly, as if watching the city unfold was part of his daily duty. Theo lay by the screen door, his ears perked but body relaxed, still too young to understand the fuss being made over him. Evelyn wasn't sure how they had found her. Not exactly. Maybe it was the tweet from that rescue group volunteer. Maybe it was Liam's art, now posted across dozens of online platforms. Or perhaps when a cat, a dog, and an old woman heal each other in a forgotten corner of town, people simply need to believe in it. She heard the familiar gravel-slow voice of Hank Delaney before she saw him. "Well, looks like you're famous now," he said as he approached, wearing his usual beat-up green parka, a thermos in one hand, and his mailbag, empty on Sundays, slung over the other shoulder. "Hank," Evelyn said, offering him a tight-lipped but genuine smile, "I didn't ask for this circus." "No, but I figure the town could use a little circus if it means remembering what kindness looks like." One of the reporters stepped forward, a woman in her early 30s with short curly auburn hair, a warm smile, and bright eyes behind large tortoiseshell glasses. Her name was Nina Sheridan, and she introduced herself with a soft handshake and a sincere tone that immediately earned Evelyn's trust. Nina wasn't flashy like the usual field reporters. She wore jeans and an oversized blazer, no bright lipstick or exaggerated expressions. She had grown up in Willow Fern, but moved away for school, only recently returning to care for her ailing mother. Her work had become a quiet act of reconnection, with her city, with stories that mattered. "We just want to share what's already touched so many hearts," she said gently. "Would you mind walking us through the journal entries? And maybe a few words about the animals?" Evelyn hesitated but nodded. She led them inside, where Theo wagged his tail shyly, and Orrin, ever the monarch of the room, leapt onto his windowsill with quiet elegance. The camera crew adjusted angles, and Nina began to read softly from Evelyn's notebook, her voice steady, reverent. Outside the house, more cars began to slow. A few neighbors stood along the sidewalk. Some brought flowers, others small packages of food. The city, it seemed, was no longer watching from afar. That same afternoon, Liam Torres stood at the front of his classroom, his small hands gripping the edges of a display board that held 3 of his drawings. His teacher, Mrs. Klein, had invited him to share an example of how art can reflect real life. And although Liam's chest buzzed with nerves, he did not back down. "This," he said, pointing to the piece titled "The Waiting One," was based on a cat who saved a dog, and maybe saved a person too. The room was still. Not because the kids were mocking him, but because for once they were listening. His words weren't loud, but they were clear. "His name's Orrin, and the dog's Theo. They live with Miss Evelyn Marlowe. They're not mine, but I think they kind of saved me too." Someone clapped, then another, then the whole room. By the end of the week, the principal had approved a small hallway exhibition of Liam's work. A dozen drawings were framed with care: cats, dogs, people, porches, windows. At the center was a title scrawled in Liam's handwriting: "Love Lives Quietly." Evelyn was invited to cut the ribbon. She wore a navy blouse, brushed her hair into a neat bun, and let Liam walk her through every piece, both of them glowing under soft school lights. But it wasn't just the school that responded. The Willow Fern Council voted to approve funds for a small rescue facility using a vacant lot behind the community garden. The proposal came with one condition: that Dr. Evelyn Marlowe be named honorary advisor and that the center carry her name, the Marlowe Haven for Strays. She laughed when she heard it. Laughed for the first time in so long, it surprised her. "I'm no saint," she told them during the council's meeting. "No," said Councilwoman Julia Reeves, a tall, sharp-featured woman with striking silver hair and an infectious laugh. but you're exactly what this town forgot it needed. On the day the rescue shelter plans were unveiled, Oren was painted onto the brick wall facing the street, a mural in black and white, curled like a guardian around a paw print-shaped heart. The local library asked Liam for permission to frame two of his pieces, Fighting the Darkness and The Home We Built, to hang in the youth reading corner. Oren had become something of a symbol, not flashy, not sensational, but noble, watchful, persistent, like hope itself. Later that night, Evelyn sat in her armchair by the fire, Theo at her feet. Oren curled beside her with his head against her ankle. Her phone buzzed quietly on the side table, filled with more notifications than she would ever care to count. Messages from strangers, well-wishers, even a vet school classmate from 40 years ago, and one from a family in nearby Millstone, the Gilmores. The email was simple, warm, and written by a woman named Marcy Gilmore. She and her husband Peter ran a small apple orchard and sheep farm. They'd seen Theo's story in the paper and instantly felt drawn to him. They had once had a German shepherd named Ranger who'd passed 2 years ago and had been waiting for the right time and the right dog to love again. "We understand you've been the first light in this dog's life," Marcy wrote. "We'd like to be the next chapter, if you'd consider us." Evelyn stared at the message for a long time, heart conflicted. She glanced down at Theo, sleeping deeply now, his body no longer shaking, his ribs beginning to fill out, his dreams no longer haunted. She reached down and touched his ear softly. "Wouldn't it be something," she whispered, "if your story kept going?" From his spot on the windowsill, Oren opened one eye but didn't move. He had already seen it coming. The city had listened. Now it was the world's turn. The morning sky was brushed with the soft lavender pink of early spring, and the dew on Evelyn Marlowe's garden glistened like 1,000 tiny goodbyes. Birds trilled from high branches, as if trying to soften the silence that had filled the house since dawn. Inside, Evelyn moved quietly through the kitchen, her steps unhurried, though everyone carried a weight she refused to show. She poured fresh water into a small dish, even though she wouldn't need it after today. Theo lay on the rug in front of the door, alert, tail sweeping softly along the wooden floor. He looked better now, fuller, steadier, his coat glossy with new life. His eyes no longer flickered with fear, but held instead a calm confidence that came from knowing, finally, that he was safe. Today, he would leave. Across the street, a silver pickup truck slowed as it pulled into the driveway. The doors opened, and out stepped Marcy Gilmore, a woman in her late 40s with sun-worn skin and kind eyes. She was tall and broad-shouldered, her brown hair tied into a loose braid beneath a felt hat. Beside her, her husband Peter Gilmore, lean and wiry with a quiet, thoughtful air, reached into the truck bed and pulled out a crate lined with a checkered blanket. On the side was stenciled one simple word: home. Evelyn stepped onto the porch as they approached, Oren brushing against her legs before settling beside her feet, ever the silent observer. "Good morning," Marcy said gently. "He looks even more beautiful than in the photos." "He's ready," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. "And you're sure it's not too soon?" Peter smiled. "We've been waiting for a dog like this since Ranger passed. He's not a replacement, just a new chapter." Evelyn nodded. She crouched to Theo's level, smoothing his ears, pressing her forehead gently to his. "You're going to be happy," she whispered, "and you'll run through orchards and chase sheep and sleep in front of fires. Just don't forget this porch, all right?" Theo licked her cheek once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then he stepped into the crate without protest, as if he understood something sacred had been exchanged between them. Marcy turned to Evelyn before loading the crate. "You gave him life, Evelyn. We'll give him the rest of it." The door closed with a soft click, and the truck pulled away, its tires crunching the gravel. From the porch, Oren watched silently, his eyes tracking the movement until the truck turned the corner and disappeared from view. Beside him, Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, the wind tugging lightly at the sleeves of her cardigan. She spoke not to Oren, but to the space left behind. "We did the right thing," she said. "Didn't we?" Oren didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. Later that afternoon, Liam appeared at the gate, his cheeks flushed from the walk and a rolled canvas tucked under one arm. He didn't knock. He rarely did now. Evelyn met him halfway down the walkway, her face soft but unreadable. "I finished it," he said simply. He unrolled the canvas. It was a wide painting done in pencil, ink, and soft watercolor washes. The center showed Theo running through an open field, tongue out, ears back. To his left, Oren sat beneath a tree, eyes calm, tail wrapped elegantly around his paws. Behind them stood Evelyn's house, warm and golden in the distance. The title, written in Liam's neat block lettering, "The Home We Built." Evelyn's hand fluttered to her mouth. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she took Liam's hand and squeezed it. "I'd like to hang it in the living room," she said, "right above the fireplace." Liam beamed. "I hoped you would." Inside, Evelyn cleared a space above the mantel, removing a dusty, untouched landscape painting that had hung there for years. She replaced it with Liam's work, and then did something she hadn't done in a decade. She placed a second armchair beside hers by the fire, a small one, child-sized, upholstered in navy and corduroy, perfect for sketching or simply sitting close in quiet company. "That's your chair now," she said. Liam's voice caught. "Really?" "Your family," she said. "Might as well sit like one." Outside the window, a breeze lifted the branches of the oak tree by the fence. The garden had begun to bloom with new life. Daffodils, tulips, and the fragile beginnings of lavender. The house had never felt so full, despite having one soul fewer inside it. That evening, as the sky turned the color of ash and honey, Evelyn brewed tea, the scent of chamomile drifting through the house. Liam sat beside the fireplace, pencil moving across a fresh sheet of paper, while Evelyn updated her journal. April 14th. Theo left today. He walked away stronger than he arrived. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because I knew he had found something bigger than comfort. He had found belonging. Oren hasn't left the porch. He watched the truck go until it disappeared, then came and laid beside me like always. I think he knows. I think he always did. Outside, the world seemed to pause. The phone buzzed once, displaying a new email from Companion Quarterly, a well-known animal advocacy magazine. The subject line read, "We'd like to feature your story, The Cat That Saved a City." Evelyn chuckled softly. She would reply tomorrow. Or maybe not. The story didn't belong to her alone, after all. It belonged to the city now, to every old soul and young dreamer who had been touched by a cat who refused to walk away, and a dog who fought to live. That night, Oren didn't curl up on the blanket near the door, as he often did. He climbed into the armchair beside Evelyn's and settled there, back straight, paws tucked, eyes half closed in contentment. He wasn't guarding anymore. He was home, spoken gently as the final image fades. Sometimes, God doesn't send angels in robes or chariots of fire. Sometimes, he sends a stray cat with silent eyes, a broken puppy with a beating heart, a lonely woman who forgot how to hope until someone needed her. And in the quiet corners of our cities, where no spotlight shines, miracles still happen. They look like kindness. They sound like second chances. They feel like home. Maybe you're Evelyn, maybe you're Theo, or maybe you're Oren, just watching, wondering if it's worth trying again. But if you believe, like we do, that love still saves, and God still sends miracles disguised as fur and footsteps, then share this story. Comment Amen if you've ever been touched by an unlikely blessing. Subscribe to this channel to help us keep sharing stories that heal. And may God bless you, wherever you are, whoever you're saving, or whoever's saving you. She was only 7, frozen cheeks, shaking hands, and a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. He was nearly dead, tied to a rusted fence, buried in snow, forgotten like trash. But when their eyes met through the storm, something ancient stirred, something sacred. She stepped out into the blizzard, not knowing the dog she saved once belonged to a ghost with secrets, a ghost who trained dogs and destroyed them. If you were there that night, would you have stepped into the snow? And if so, are you ready to witness the story they were never supposed to survive? The world outside the SUV was a blur of white and silence, the kind that muffled every sound and turned breath into smoke. Snow fell in relentless sheets, wrapping the mountains and winding roads of Maple Hollow in a shroud of winter so thick it seemed to erase time itself. Inside the vehicle, 7-year-old Callie Heron sat in complete stillness, her small frame curled against the backseat window, her pale cheek pressed to the cold glass, and her amber eyes, once bright and curious, were vacant, rimmed with exhaustion, and a sorrow far too old for someone so young. Her long chestnut hair was tangled beneath a knit hat, and her hands clutched a frayed stuffed rabbit named Thomas, the only thing that smelled faintly of her mother, now 3 weeks gone. Her mother's death had silenced her. Since the accident, Callie had spoken no more than a dozen words. The car crash had taken more than a parent. It had taken safety, voice, and warmth. Everything now felt like before and after, and Callie drifted somewhere in the cold space in between. Driving the SUV was Maggie Lowe, a seasoned child welfare officer in her late 30s. Maggie was tall, with a sharp-featured face made sterner by years of work that had taken more from her heart than it had given. Her straight auburn hair was tied in a tight bun beneath a wool cap, and her posture was always braced, as if for impact. Maggie had once been open-hearted, gentle, but after a tragic incident involving a child she'd placed in the wrong home, she had become methodical and emotionally armored. She cared deeply, but she didn't let herself show it anymore. Her job today was simple: deliver Callie safely to the girl's estranged grandfather, Ellis Heron, and move on. They were only 15 minutes from Maple Hollow when Callie shifted suddenly, her breath catching. She leaned forward, fogging the glass with her breath, eyes squinting through the snow. "There's something there," she whispered, her voice cracked, brittle with disuse. Maggie didn't hear her. She was focused on the slick, barely visible road. The wind howled against the windshield, and snow lashed in every direction like a living thing. Then, louder this time, clearer, Callie cried, "Stop the car! Please! There's something there!" Startled, Maggie's gloved hands jerked on the wheel, and the SUV skidded slightly before she brought it to a stop at the side of the road. The tires crunched into the snowbank, and the engine idled with a low hum. Maggie turned toward the back seat. "What? What did you see?" But Callie had already unbuckled herself and was fumbling with the door. "Callie, wait! Stop!" Too late. The girl jumped out, boots sinking deep into the snow. Maggie cursed under her breath and grabbed her coat from the passenger seat before following. The wind hit her like a wall. It howled through the trees and bit into her skin through the layers. Snow clung to her eyelashes and filled her boots in seconds. She shielded her face with one hand and followed Callie, who was already trudging, toward the edge of a barbed wire fence bordering a thicket of trees. And then Maggie saw it. There, barely distinguishable from the snow-covered ground, was a German shepherd slumped against the base of a fence post. The dog's fur, once likely a proud mix of black and tan, was caked in frost and filth. It was curled tightly against itself, ribcage heaving in shallow motion, its muzzle white with ice. A thick rope dug deep into the fur of its neck, tying it to the fence as if discarded like garbage. Its ears twitched, barely, and its dull eyes lifted enough to meet Callie's. Callie fell to her knees beside the animal without hesitation. Her coat flared open, and she wrapped it tightly around the dog's broken frame. She pressed her body against it, offering what little warmth she had. The cold struck her immediately, leaching into her fingers, her legs, her lungs. "Kai," she whispered. "Your name is Kai." The dog whimpered faintly. He couldn't lift his head, but his eyes fluttered closed at her voice, as if in fragile relief. Maggie finally caught up, panting, stunned by the sight. "Callie, what are you doing?" she gasped, then saw the rope. "Oh my God!" She dropped to her knees, her jeans soaking through in seconds. "Someone did this on purpose." Callie didn't respond. Her lips were already turning pale, her small hands trembling. Her face pressed into the dog's icy fur. The animal made no effort to move, but allowed her presence as though knowing she meant no harm. "We have to get you both out of here now," Maggie said, her voice sharpened by fear. She reached for her phone with one hand while fumbling in her coat for a pocket knife with the other. She dialed 911. No signal. She stepped a few feet to the left, tried again. Nothing. Snow howled harder, driving sideways now. The rope around the dog's neck was frozen stiff. Maggie sawed at it, hands numb and clumsy. Her blade slipped and sliced her palm. She winced, kept cutting. Callie swayed, nearly collapsed beside the dog. Her skin was pale as paper now. "No, no, no, stay with me," Maggie muttered. The rope finally gave way with a snap. Maggie lunged, catching the dog's frail body in her arms. He was startlingly light, starved and barely alive. His age showed in the graying around his eyes, maybe 6 or 7 years old, but his muscles were still taut beneath the skin, despite the weight loss. The kind of dog bred for work, for loyalty, for war. "Kai," Callie whispered again before she slumped forward into Maggie's side. "Callie!" Maggie scooped the girl into one arm and the dog in the other, adrenaline overriding pain. She staggered back toward the SUV, the snow nearly blinding her. Her legs ached with every step, but the weight of what she carried pushed her forward. She made it to the vehicle, wrenched the door open, and slid both dog and girl inside. She cranked the heat, turned on the defroster, and wrapped them both in every blanket she could find. Callie's eyes fluttered open weakly. Her lips moved. "He's warm now." Maggie stared at her, heart hammering. She opened her phone again, still no signal. She looked out the window, at the empty road, at the snow falling harder than ever. Someone had left a dog to die out here. Someone had made sure help couldn't reach them. She looked back at Callie, now curled against the German Shepherd, both of them breathing, barely. "Hang on, kid," she whispered. "Hang on, Kai." The house at the end of Millbrook Lane had once been painted red, though now it was dulled by age and dusted with frost. A small gabled roof leaned slightly to the left, and the porch sagged in protest under the weight of fresh snow. There were no Christmas lights, no welcome mat, only a weathered door with 3 deep scratches near the bottom, scratches that had been there for years and had never been explained. Inside, the air was dry and cold, as if warmth had long since abandoned the place. Ellis Heron, a man in his early 70s with a square jaw and sun-weathered skin, stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, brow furrowed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with thinning white hair and a limp in his left leg that made every second step a quiet curse. His flannel shirt hung loosely over his frame, and his jeans were the same pair he'd worn for years. Frayed, but clean. His face was carved with hard lines and silence. He had the kind of presence that could either calm a room or freeze it, and today he was frozen. He hadn't seen his granddaughter Callie since she was a baby. His relationship with her mother, his only daughter, had fractured years ago, splintered by grief and things unsaid after the death of his wife. When news of her passing reached him, Ellis had only nodded. When Child Services called and asked if he'd take Callie in, he said yes without thinking. And when Maggie Lowe stepped through his door that morning, holding a near-frozen child and an emaciated dog, Ellis had blinked twice, then stepped aside. "Where can I put him?" Maggie asked, her breath still visible in the hallway. Ellis gestured toward the couch near the cold fireplace. "There." Maggie lowered the large German Shepherd onto a wool blanket, her arms trembling from strain. Kai, his ribs sharp as blades, his paws cracked and bleeding, let out a low grunt and closed his eyes. Callie trailed behind, her cheeks still red from the cold, but her steps steady. She sat cross-legged on the floor beside the dog, one hand on his flank, the other still clinging to her rabbit. Ellis watched from a distance, arms still folded. Maggie noted the hesitation, the tension in his jaw, the way he looked at the girl as if she were both a stranger and a ghost. "You should get a fire going," she said without looking at him. "I know how to care for a house," Ellis replied, gruff. He moved slowly toward the fireplace, opened the iron grate, and began stacking wood. His hands were weathered, knuckles large and swollen from years of fighting fires and fate. Once the fire roared to life, Maggie crouched beside Callie. "He'll need warmth through the night. Do you have more blankets?" "In the closet down the hall," Ellis said, nodding toward the left. "Top shelf." Maggie retrieved them and returned, draping one over the dog and another around Callie's shoulders. The heat from the fire began to soften the cold in the room, though the silence remained sharp. "Do you have any food?" "He hasn't eaten," Maggie asked. "I've got broth." "It's all he can manage for now," Ellis muttered and disappeared into the kitchen. The cabinets creaked when opened. The kettle hissed like a snake on the stove. Maggie sat on the edge of the armchair and finally allowed herself a moment to rest. Her fingers were stiff, her heart still racing from the storm. She glanced at Callie, who hadn't spoken since arriving, and at the dog, who lay breathing in shallow rhythm. "That's a good dog," she said softly. "He's more than that," Callie whispered. Maggie looked at her, surprised at the sound. "His name is Kai. He told me." Maggie smiled gently. "Did he now?" Callie nodded. "He remembers something. I can feel it." Ellis returned with a bowl of warm broth and knelt beside the dog. He offered it slowly, and to his surprise, Kai licked at it, weakly but steadily. Ellis studied the dog's face, something flickering in his expression. "He's been trained," he said quietly. "What makes you think that?" Maggie asked. "He didn't flinch when I touched his paws. Most strays bite when you go for their feet. He let me near his mouth, too. That's not fear, that's discipline." "You would know," Maggie said. "They said you were on the department for almost 40 years. Ellis grunted. 20 active, 20 more doing inspections. I saw all kinds." He didn't elaborate, and Maggie didn't press, but something about the dog had changed his tone. Later that evening, after Callie had fallen asleep beside the fire, curled up against Kai's side, Maggie walked into the kitchen where Ellis was scrubbing dried blood from the edge of the bowl. He didn't look up. "She loves that dog already," she said. "She doesn't even know him. She didn't know you either." Ellis said nothing. "She risked her life to save him," Maggie continued. "Took off her coat in the middle of a blizzard. Nearly passed out from cold. She didn't hesitate." Still silence. Then Ellis spoke, voice low and tired. "She's just like her mother." Maggie softened. "What happened?" "She stopped talking to me after her mother died. I couldn't say the right things. Or maybe I said too many of the wrong ones." He dried the bowl slowly. "She said I always saw fire in everything. Always looking for what might go wrong. And I guess she was right." Maggie hesitated, then leaned against the counter. "You know, I looked into some records before coming here. Your name came up once, 20 years ago. House fire outside Fairview. Reports said it was an animal facility. Private, illegal." Ellis stiffened slightly. "You're digging up old ghosts." "They were never buried," she said. "Do you remember the name Douglas Reed?" That name stopped him cold. He turned, face ashen. "I remember." "What happened to him?" Ellis shook his head slowly. "Disappeared. A few months after the fire. Some said he skipped town, others said he was silenced." "Silenced by who?" "I don't know," Ellis said. "But I remember the fire, dogs in cages, burnt beyond recognition. Some survived, barely. I filed the report. Then I was told to forget it. Reed, he was part of the rescue effort, or so he said. But he came back days later with questions no one wanted to answer." Maggie crossed her arms. "That dog in there, Kai. He reacted earlier. He flinched when he passed your bookcase, like he smelled something familiar." Ellis's eyes narrowed. "That case has my old reports." "Then maybe it's time someone opened it." Ellis didn't respond. But later that night, after Maggie had gone to the guest room and the fire had dimmed, he sat alone in front of the bookcase. He stared at it for a long time before reaching behind a row of dusty volumes. He pulled out an old file, its edges curled and yellowed with time. He opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, burned cages, half-charred collars, ashes, and in one corner, a younger version of himself beside a tall man with cold eyes and a sharp smile. Douglas Reed, former team leader, missing for nearly 2 decades. Ellis looked toward the fireplace. Callie stirred in her sleep. Kai's ear twitched, and for a moment, his amber eyes opened and locked with Ellis's. Something in those eyes remembered. Ellis whispered, more to himself than anyone, "What did they do to you, boy?" And for the first time in years, Ellis Heron felt a door in his heart creak open.
The snow had eased by morning, leaving a frozen world glazed in stillness. Sunlight filtered through a gauze of thin clouds, casting long, cold shadows across the porch of the Heron house. Inside, the quiet was fragile, like the breath held between memory and revelation. Kai lay curled on the worn rug before the fireplace, one paw stretched protectively toward Callie, who slept beside him with her rabbit pressed under her chin. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm. His ears occasionally twitched, and once he let out a low whimper, as if chasing something in his sleep he couldn't quite outrun. Ellis stood at the window, a mug of black coffee untouched in his hand. He stared at the woods beyond his property line, where the snow still clung thick to the branches like silence that hadn't melted yet. He hadn't slept. His eyes were rimmed red, and the file he'd opened the night before still lay on the table, its contents fanned across the oak like wounds reopened. He looked older this morning, not because of age, but because something inside him had begun to shift, against his will. A sudden sound pierced the stillness. From somewhere in the distance, a fire engine siren let out a sharp wail, brief but unmistakable. The effect on Kai was immediate. The dog jolted upright, his eyes wild. A guttural growl tore from his throat, and his limbs flailed as he tried to stand, only to collapse sideways. His breathing became erratic, nostrils flaring, and he let out a bark so raw it scraped the walls. His body trembled violently. Ellis rushed forward, kneeling beside the dog. Kai, easy now, easy," he said, voice low, one hand on the dog's shoulder. But the shepherd didn't respond to voice or touch. His eyes darted toward the window, teeth bared. Callie sat up with a cry. "What's wrong with him?" Maggie burst in from the kitchen, her face pale. "What happened?" "Sirens," Ellis said, jaw tightening. "That sound triggered something." Callie crawled over, placing both hands on Kai's face. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's not real. It's not now." And slowly, impossibly, Kai calmed. His breathing steadied and the tension in his shoulders eased. He rested his head against Callie's lap, closing his eyes, but his tail remained stiff and unmoving. Ellis exchanged a glance with Maggie, then stood up and left the room. He returned moments later with a leather medical kit and a small flashlight. "I want to check something," he muttered. Kai didn't resist as Ellis gently rolled him onto his side. The man's hands, despite their size, were deliberate and controlled. Hands that once pulled children from fire, that now moved with surgical care across fur and scar. Then Ellis stopped. There, just above Kai's belly, hidden beneath a tangle of matted fur, was a faint, straight scar. Too clean, too intentional. Ellis cleaned the area with warm water, revealing the full incision. "This was done by someone who knew what they were doing," he said grimly. "This isn't from a fight or accident. This is surgical." Maggie frowned. "For what? Sterilization?" "Maybe once," Ellis said, "but not this deep. This looks like an implant site." He reached for his scalpel, sterilized it over a lighter flame, and began to cut, just enough to explore the scarred tissue beneath. Callie looked away, burying her face into a rabbit. Maggie crouched beside her, hand on her back. After a few minutes, Ellis pulled out a small fragment of something metallic, slick with blood. "A chip," he whispered. It wasn't a commercial ID chip. Those were embedded near the shoulder and looked different. This one was flatter, harder, its edges worn. "What is that?" Maggie asked. Ellis placed it on a paper towel. "It looks like a data chip, a tracking device maybe, but this isn't standard military or medical. This is off-book." Maggie stared at it, jaw clenched. Then she stood and fished her phone from her coat. "I know someone who might know." Within the hour, she sat on the porch with her phone to her ear, pacing. Behind her, the trees were quiet, but the air felt watched. "Lucian," she said when the call connected, "it's Maggie." Lucian Blake was not the kind of man easily rattled. In his 40s, wiry and angular with silver threading through his black curls, he had the perpetual look of someone who hadn't slept enough and liked it that way. His clothes were always one layer too thin for the season, his glasses crooked, and his tone too dry for comfort. But beneath the sarcasm and scorn for bureaucracy, Lucian had the instincts of a bloodhound and the moral clarity of someone who'd seen too many things covered up. He'd once been a top-tier investigative journalist, until 3 years ago, when a series of articles on cross-state experimental animal labs had gotten him blacklisted from every mainstream newsroom. Since then, he worked independently, filing reports from the shadows, chased by threats and subpoenas alike. "What kind of chip?" he asked. His voice was rough, the kind of voice that knew too many late-night truths. "I don't know, but it was inside a dog, a German shepherd, surgical scar. Looks military or worse." "Was the dog a rescue?" "No, abandoned, tied to a fence in the snow. A child found him." There was a pause. Then Lucian asked quietly, "What's the code on the chip?" Maggie read it aloud. Lucian went silent again. When he spoke next, his tone had shifted. "That prefix isn't veterinary. It's from a lab registry, biodevice tracking. You've got something big." Maggie felt the chill move deeper into her bones. "Can you run it?" "I'll try, send it. If it's from who I think it is, we've stumbled into something they'd kill to keep buried." "Be careful," Maggie said. "Always," he replied, and the line went dead. Maggie stepped back into the house, pausing at the threshold. Ellis had wrapped Kai's side and was now standing at the sink, hands red from washing blood. Callie was curled with the dog again, humming something soft and tuneless. "We may have just opened a door that doesn't close," Maggie said. "I think," Ellis replied without turning, "that door was already open." That night, after the lights dimmed and Maggie dozed off in the armchair, Ellis found himself back at the window. The wind had picked up again, sending small drifts across the front walk. He sipped his coffee and narrowed his eyes. A car was parked half a block down, black, unmarked, too clean for a local. The windows were tinted, the engine was off. Ellis didn't move. He just stared. In the darkened living room, Kai stirred from sleep. His ears perked, his nose twitched. Then he growled, a low, primal rumble. Outside, the car remained still.
The wind returned that night, louder than before, curling around the Heron house like an ancient thing clawing to be let in. The trees outside scraped and swayed, casting long shadows on the frosted windows, and the creaking of the porch boards came in uneven rhythm, like footsteps too soft to be trusted. But inside, the fireplace glowed steady, and Kai, nestled beside Callie, breathed quietly, his body still sore but no longer trembling with fever. Callie had taken to sleeping near him every night since the rescue, insisting that he stayed calm when she was close. That bond, unspoken and immediate, had only grown stronger. She whispered to him often, and sometimes, Ellis swore, the dog listened like he understood every word. It was on the fourth morning that it began, the scratching sound. Callie was the first to hear it, faint and rhythmic, like something shifting beneath her feet. At first, she thought it was mice or old pipes, but when she followed the sound to a far corner of the living room, where the old bookshelf stood tilted against the wall, the noise stopped altogether. Kai approached her side and sniffed the floorboards. His ears perked, tail rigid. Then he gave a single low growl. "What is it?" Callie whispered. Kai stepped forward and began scratching at a plank near the baseboard. Dust rose and the scent of mildew crept into the room. Ellis, who had just entered with a cup of coffee, paused mid-step. "Callie, don't touch that," he said sharply. Callie froze. "There's something down there." Ellis walked over slowly. He stared at the floor, at the old nails, the worn grooves in the wood, places he'd ignored for years. Then, with a quiet sigh, he placed the coffee cup on the windowsill and knelt down. He ran his fingers along the edge of the plank, then reached behind the bookshelf and pressed a panel. With a mechanical clunk, something shifted. A trapdoor. Maggie, standing in the kitchen doorway, folded her arms. "You didn't think to mention you had a sealed basement?" "I forgot it existed," Ellis muttered. "It's been closed since before Claire was born." "You forgot a basement?" She raised an eyebrow. He didn't answer. Together they lifted the heavy door, the hinges groaning like a waking animal. A narrow wooden staircase led downward into darkness. Cold, damp air wafted up, a mix of earth, rust, and something older. Kai didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and began to descend, pausing only to make sure Callie followed. They made their way down, flashlights in hand, their beams cutting through the musty gloom. The basement was smaller than expected, half walls of unfinished concrete, shelves lined with decaying boxes, and a rusted desk in one corner. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Ellis's face had gone tight. "This used to be my workroom. I kept old records here, back when I still thought someone might listen." "What kind of records?" Maggie asked, kneeling beside the shelves. "Fire reports. Cases that never made it to trial. Things I wasn't supposed to keep." Callie wandered toward the desk. She pulled open a drawer, coughing at the dust cloud that escaped. Inside was a stack of laminated ID tags, collars, and a small plastic folder, water-stained but mostly intact. She handed it to Ellis. He flipped it open. Inside was a photograph. Kai, younger, sharper, stood proudly in front of a scorched training yard, his ears high and eyes focused. Beside him was a man in his 40s, with sun-browned skin, squared shoulders, and a firm but kind expression. His badge read, "Douglas Reed." "Dear God," Ellis whispered. Maggie stepped closer. "That's him, isn't it?" Ellis nodded slowly. "That's Reed. He used to run an off-the-books K-9 program, funded by local contracts, private donations. He trained dogs for more than patrol, search and rescue, explosives, high-risk evacuations." "And Kai was one of them?" Maggie asked. "The best," Ellis replied. "I saw him pull a man out from a collapsed shaft on his first deployment. They called him Ghost, because he moved like one, silent and sure." Callie knelt beside Kai and gently touched his ear. "You remember him, don't you?" Kai leaned into her touch. They searched deeper into the basement, uncovering faded rosters, medical files, and a dusty black case. Inside were 3 micro-drives labeled only with dates. Ellis pocketed them without a word. Then, Just as they were about to head upstairs, Kai growled again. "What now?" Maggie whispered. The door at the top of the stairs creaked. Footsteps. Ellis's expression hardened. "Stay here." He moved quietly, retrieving the fire poker from beside the furnace and creeping up the stairs. He paused at the threshold, listening. The living room was silent, but the front door was slightly ajar. Snowflakes fluttered in on the wind. He stepped out. The room was empty until he noticed the file folder on the table had been disturbed. The photograph of Reed and Kai was gone. Ellis scanned the room, then the hallway. No movement. But outside, fresh boot prints in the snow led toward the road, where the same black car from the night before was now gone. He returned to the basement, jaw tight. "Someone broke in, took the photo." Maggie's face went pale. "They're watching us." "I think they've been watching a long time." That evening, Maggie placed a call to Lucian from her laptop, now connected through a secure proxy network using software Lucian had insisted she install last year. His face appeared grainy and lit by a single desk lamp. He looked sleep-deprived, with a 2-day stubble and coffee-stained hoodie. "I got it," he said before she could speak. The chip's data was encrypted, but not very well. Someone wanted to hide it fast, not forever. "What did it say?" Maggie asked. Lucian leaned closer. "Kai was part of a rescue team deployed to a mining town 3 years ago, Collings Pass. Explosion collapsed half the shaft. 17 people trapped. 6 rescued thanks to a K-9 team. And all records were erased within 48 hours. State files, FEMA reports, even local news. Like the incident never happened." "Why?" Maggie asked, though she already feared the answer. "I don't know yet," Lucian admitted, "but I'll tell you this. Whoever erased that file had the clearance to do it cleanly. Federal clean." Ellis stood behind her, arms crossed. "They left the dog alive." "Maybe they didn't think he'd live," Lucian said. "Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe," he paused, voice dropping, "he saw something down there they needed erased." The call ended in silence. That night, Callie awoke in the middle of the night. The fire had burned low, and Kai was staring at the window, his body stiff. "What is it?" she whispered, crawling over. Kai didn't move. In the darkened pane, just for a moment, she saw the reflection of someone standing in the trees, watching. The road out of Maple Hollow wound through a stretch of forgotten land. No streetlights, no houses, only a jagged ribbon of cracked asphalt buried beneath a crust of old snow. On the morning the cold broke just enough for breath not to turn instantly to mist, Kai stood stiffly at the back door of the Heron house, ears alert, nose twitching into the rising wind. He was motionless for a long while, then turned to Ellis with a deliberate gaze, the kind of look that demanded trust rather than obedience. "He wants to go somewhere," Ellis said, pulling on his coat. Callie, already bundled in layers, stepped forward. "Where, Kai?" Kai didn't bark. He simply walked to the edge of the yard and waited, his tail still, his breath slow, like something old was guiding his body. Ellis, Maggie, and Callie followed, trudging through snowdrifts up to their knees. Maggie kept glancing over her shoulder. The image of that black car in the trees still burned in her thoughts like a ghost with headlights. They passed Nolan's house on the way, a single-story bungalow tucked between overgrown hedges and a sagging mailbox. Nolan Briggs, age 10, watched them from behind his frosted bedroom window, his eyes wide. A quiet child with a mop of reddish curls and pale skin prone to bruising, Nolan had never said a word in public. Doctors labeled him selectively mute, though no diagnosis ever accounted for the intensity in his sketches. Inside, alone with a set of colored pencils and too many secrets, Nolan was sketching again. Lines hard, repetitive, fierce. He had seen them weeks ago, men in black coats dragging cages behind their truck under cover of night. He had drawn their faces, though he wasn't sure they had any. He had drawn the dogs too, eyes like Kai's, but hollowed by something darker. One image showed a tall man with a scarred neck, leading a younger dog by a chain. In the corner of that page, he had written a single name in careful, trembling print, Reed. But outside, Kai led the group toward the woods. The trees thinned after a mile, and they emerged onto a stretch of land that had clearly once been cleared for construction. Flattened earth now buried under frost and brittle grass. Half-collapsed fencing outlined a square perimeter, and in the center, a squat building stood half swallowed by snow. Its tin roof had caved in, and ivy strangled what was left of the siding. A training field, once lined with painted tires and wooden hurdles, now lay broken, the equipment charred or rotted into the ground. Ellis stopped short. "This was the old compound," he said, his voice low. "The one Reed operated before the fire. They called it Station 9. Unofficial, off-grid. The county never listed it on any public record." Kai padded forward, slower now, his limbs stiff but deliberate. He stopped in front of the crumbling shed near the far end of the lot, then growled, a sound not born of warning but mourning. His tail dropped. He stared at the door. Callie reached for Ellis's hand. "Something's inside," she whispered. They approached together. Ellis pulled the rusted latch, and the door gave way with a moan. Inside was the stink of rot, rust, and something worse. The space had once been a holding shed. Metal hooks lined the ceiling, and the floor was covered in layers of mold and old straw. And in the corner, tethered to a bolted ring in the wall, was the skeletal remains of a German shepherd. Its collar had fused into the bone, its body curled inward like it had died waiting for someone who never came. Callie gasped. Maggie turned away, her throat tight, but Kai stepped forward. He didn't sniff. He didn't growl. Instead, he tilted his head to the sky and let out a long, hollow howl, a sound so human it cracked through Ellis's bones. It wasn't just pain. It was memory, recognition, grief. The sound echoed across the trees like a bell tolling for the forgotten. Ellis knelt beside the corpse and reached out, brushing a patch of leather barely clinging to the collar. A tag dangled loosely, corroded but still legible. "Delta," he read. Kai let out another cry, quieter this time. He backed away, eyes wide with something close to fear. "Was he one of Reed's?" Maggie asked, voice shaking. Ellis nodded. "One of the earliest." "I remember her. Delta was a scent tracker. Small, fast, smarter than most people I knew. She went missing around the time Reed did." Callie stepped forward and gently placed her rabbit beside the dog's bones. "No one should be alone like that," she said. Ellis's face was hard. "This wasn't just abandonment. Someone locked her here, left her to starve." They sealed the door behind them and walked back toward the road in silence, the wind biting their faces, their shadows long against the snow. Later that evening, Maggie and Lucian met at the outskirts of town to exchange the decrypted data chip and files they'd found in the basement. The plan was simple. Lucian would take the evidence to a contact in Chicago, someone with enough reach to keep them from being silenced. They parked in a clearing, headlights low, breath-forming clouds between them. "You need to get out before this burns hotter," Lucian said, pocketing the chip. "There are eyes on you." "I know," Maggie replied, "but if we don't finish this, what happens to the others like Kai?" Lucian gave a crooked smile. "That's why I brought this." He pulled out a flash drive and handed it to her. "Copy of the full chip," he said. "If something happens to me, you leak it." Before Maggie could reply, headlights cut through the woods behind them. A black SUV roared into the clearing, blocking the road. A tall man in a black coat stepped out. His face was clean-shaven, angular, but his expression was empty. A face sculpted for intimidation, not recognition. His eyes settled on Lucian. "You need to stop digging," the man said calmly. "This doesn't concern you anymore." Lucian squared his shoulders. "Doesn't concern me? You're burying animals alive and scrubbing disaster sites. We warned you last time." Then the man stepped closer, his voice dropping. "If you want to keep your throat, don't dig too deep." Maggie stepped forward, placing herself between them. "You won't scare us." But the man didn't even glance at her. He turned, climbed into the SUV, and disappeared into the trees. Lucian exhaled slowly. Next time, they won't talk first. Back at the Heron house, Callie sat beside Kai, who hadn't moved since they'd returned. She held a notebook on her lap and turned to a fresh page. The drawing she began was simple at first. A cabin in the woods, a girl and her dog, a rabbit in the snow. But then she started sketching fire. Black lines curling from windows, figures dragging cages, a tall man with no face. Outside, Nolan watched from his window, flipping through his sketchbook with trembling fingers. On the last page, he had drawn a face, a real one, and next to it, in red pencil, a message. He's back. It began with a photograph, faded and folded, buried deep in a stack of old local newspapers Ellis had kept in a box labeled Training Archives. The page itself was brittle, the ink yellowed with time. The article bore the title, Local Hero Trains Elite K-9 Team for Emergency Response, and beneath it was an image, 3 dogs seated in a line, alert and proud, and a man behind them, tall and lean, a ghost from the past. Read. Kai was asleep by the fire when Ellis found it. Maggie was sorting documents nearby, Callie and Nolan playing quietly with a deck of cards on the rug. But the moment the photograph was laid flat on the table, the change in Kai was immediate. He rose with startling speed, snarling, a primal, guttural sound, his fur bristling as he stared at the image. He lunged, paws skidding across the floor, and bit down hard on the paper, tearing it in half before Ellis could react. Callie jumped, startled, and Maggie dropped the folder she was holding. "Kai!" Ellis barked, rushing forward, but the dog backed away from them all, tail tucked, panting in ragged bursts. He didn't attack. He retreated, circling to the far corner of the room where he pressed his body against the wall, eyes wild, trembling. "He knows him," Maggie whispered. "He remembers," Ellis corrected, staring down at the torn photo. And whatever Reed did, it wasn't training. It was something darker. Later that night, after ensuring Callie and Kai were both calm and safe, Ellis made a call he'd been avoiding for over a decade. The number was scratched into the underside of his toolbox, right beside the handle of a wrench he hadn't used since his knees gave out. The man who answered had a voice like gravel dragged through smoke. "Jensen," he said, curt. "It's Ellis." There was silence. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again," Jensen muttered. "I found a dog. A German shepherd." "You found Kai." Ellis's blood ran cold. "You knew he was still alive?" "No," Jensen said, voice lower now, "but I always hoped he was the one." Jensen agreed to meet him at a roadside diner just outside town. Maggie offered to drive, needing to clear her head after the home intrusion, her laptop gone, her evidence lost, and the violation clawing at the edges of her calm. She wore her hair up in a loose bun that night, eyes rimmed with sleepless worry, her breath shallow as she stared out the windshield. "I sent everything to the federal office," she said. "I thought I had time. They came for it that fast." Ellis grunted. "They're watching everything now." The diner was nearly empty when they arrived. A flickering neon sign above the window buzzed with dying energy. Inside, the coffee smelled burnt, and the booths were cracked with age. Sitting at the back, wearing a wool coat over a police-issued sweater, was Officer Glenn Jensen. A man in his late 60s, wide-shouldered with a silver beard and deep-set eyes that never stopped scanning. A deep scar ran across his right temple, and he carried the posture of a man who hadn't retired, just been put on pause. He rose when Ellis entered, his handshake firm but restrained. Maggie offered a nod. "I remember you," Jensen said. "You used to work fire investigations. Always had a pen behind your ear." "Still do," Ellis replied. They sat. "We found what's left of the Station 9 site," Ellis began. "One dog, Delta, chained and starved. Kai led us there, and now he's reacting to Reed's photo like he's seen the devil." Jensen sighed, leaning back. "That's because he has." He took a sip of coffee, grimacing at the taste, then continued. "Reed wasn't what the papers said. He started with good intentions. He really believed dogs could do more than anyone thought. Rescue, infiltration, disaster response. He got funding from private donors and pushed every limit, but the pressure made him paranoid. He started demanding absolute obedience, no mistakes. If a dog failed a drill, he punished them like soldiers: starvation, solitary confinement, noise conditioning, shock floors. Ellis stiffened. "That's abuse," Jensen nodded. "And most of us knew. But by the time we realized what he was doing, the whole operation was off book. We were told to keep our mouths shut. One night, I walked in on him screaming at a shepherd who wouldn't enter a burning structure during a test run. That dog was Kai." Jensen rubbed his face with a shaking hand. "He was the only one who didn't break, so Reed erased him. No discharge, no retirement record, just gone. Too unstable," he told the board. Then came the fire. Some say it was an accident. I say it was a cover-up. "Where's Reed now?" Maggie asked. "No one knows. Some say he vanished. Others think someone helped him disappear. He had friends in quiet places." Meanwhile, back at the Heron house, the snow had picked up again. Callie wanted to take Kai to the frozen creek behind the property. He'd been pacing for hours, ears twitching at every noise. She bundled up, called softly to Nolan, who followed without a word, mittens flopping at his sides. At the edge of the creek, they found a patch of half-melted snow and a tangle of broken reeds. Kai froze, his tail lifted slightly, and his breath steamed into the air like a signal. Then the ice beneath Callie cracked. She had taken one step too far. There was no time to scream, just a splash, a burst of white, and then she was gone beneath the surface. Kai lunged forward, barking furiously, teeth snapping at the ice, his paws scrambling against the surface. Nolan stood frozen, fists clenched, his mouth open but silent. And then he shouted, "Callie!" It was the first word he had spoken in over a year. His voice cracked, raw with terror. Inside the house, Ellis heard it. So did Maggie. By the time they reached the creek, Kai had pulled Callie partially from the water, teeth gripping her coat, his body half submerged. Ellis ran into the frigid stream and grabbed them both, hauling them to shore. Maggie wrapped Callie in blankets. Nolan stood beside them, stunned, lips trembling. Ellis looked at him. "You did good, kid," he said softly. "Real good." That night, Kai lay beside Callie's bed, his fur still damp. She clutched his paw in her small hand, her skin pale but warm. Maggie sat beside her, while Ellis stood by the window, staring at the moonlight reflected off the snow. "He remembered her," Maggie whispered. Ellis nodded. "And now we remember him." But they weren't alone. Across town, inside a rusted trailer at the edge of a logging yard, a man lit a cigarette with a trembling hand. He stared at a monitor displaying a paused security feed. Ellis's basement, Maggie's car, the woods near the creek. He zoomed in on a face, Kai. Next to him, on a crate filled with vials and tracking collars, lay a weathered name tag scorched at the edges. Reed. The man exhaled smoke, eyes cold. "They never stay buried," he muttered. The snow fell heavier that night, thick flakes piling onto the old pine branches like silence laying traps. In the darkness beneath those branches, something stirred. Quiet boots against old leaves, the soft flick of a tail, a breath drawn in before a scream. They had come for her. Callie didn't see them at first. One minute she and Kai were walking with Ellis through the edge of the forest clearing, tracking down a signal Lucian said was coming from an old surveillance unit, rumored to still record from Station 9's perimeter. The next, she was alone. A cloth had covered her mouth, something sharp pressed to her neck, and the last sound she heard was Kai barking, snarling, and then yelping before everything went black. When Ellis awoke, face bruised from the blow that sent him into the snow, Callie and Kai were gone. Maggie stood over him, flashlight trembling in her hand, eyes wild. "They took her," she said. He rose without a word. Blood dripped from his temple, but he didn't feel it. Nolan stood nearby, white-knuckled, holding a broken branch like a sword. His eyes were enormous. "Truck tracks," Ellis muttered, scanning the snow. "Headed west. Deep tire treads. Heavy load. They must have gotten the coordinates from the tracker Lucian found," Maggie said, teeth gritted. "The backup drive was too easy to steal. We were bait." Just then, Ellis's phone buzzed. A private line Lucian had routed through an encrypted channel. He answered. "They've gone dark," Lucian's voice crackled. "But I picked up a secondary signal, 5 miles north. There's a service road that cuts through the upper ridge, unmarked." "You think they're moving her?" Ellis asked. "No," Lucian said grimly. "I think they're burying her." They didn't wait. Ellis's old truck, barely holding together through rust and salt, tore up the mountainside as fast as the chains on the tires would allow. Maggie rode shotgun, loading a pistol she hadn't touched since her time as a field agent in her 20s. It was one of the many secrets she kept tucked behind her soft-spoken manner, a weapon forged from old fire and burned bridges. Nolan sat behind them, silent but fierce, clutching a small handheld radio Lucian had given him earlier that day. Ellis didn't ask why the boy insisted on bringing it. As they reached the ridge, the storm thickened. Winds howled across the mountainside, and the road narrowed to a snake's width of cleared snow. Maggie spotted the tail end of a black SUV disappearing around a bend, barely visible through the whipping flurries. "There!" she shouted. Ellis didn't hesitate. He floored it. The truck rocketed around the corner, fishtailing across a sheet of ice. The SUV ahead of them swerved, then accelerated. A chase ignited. Two vehicles barreling through snow-covered forest trails, tires spitting slush, engines growling like beasts beneath the storm. Then, the road curved around a narrow ridge, nothing but sheer drop on one side and packed woods on the other. The SUV swerved left into a narrow path, disappearing behind a curtain of branches. Ellis started to follow, but the wheels hit a hidden patch of black ice. The truck jerked. Ellis lost control. The world tilted. The passenger side skidded toward the cliff's edge. The front tire dipped, then dropped into air. The truck tilted violently. Maggie screamed, grabbing Nolan, and Ellis fought the wheel with both hands, breath frozen in his lungs. Then, miraculously, the rear wheels caught traction. With a deafening crunch of metal and snow, the truck yanked back onto the road. Ellis slammed on the brakes. The three of them sat breathless, every bone singing with adrenaline. "Still want to turn around?" Ellis said, voice hoarse. Maggie just gave a tight nod. "Drive." Following broken branches and fresh treads, they found an old logging shack hidden at the base of the mountain. A narrow trapdoor behind it led underground, an old storage cellar reinforced with steel and stripped clean of markings. Inside, Callie sat tied to a pipe. Her face was pale, her coat missing, and her knees scraped, but her eyes were clear. And beside her, bloodied but alive, was Kai, curled tight around her as if shielding her with his body. His fur was matted with dirt and blood, but his eyes still burned with fire. The door burst open. "Callie!" Maggie cried. "Grandpa!" Callie shouted, voice cracking with relief. Kai rose first. Despite the limp in his front leg, he lunged at the man closest to them, Reed. Now older, leaner, and carved with time, Reed had deep-set eyes like ice chips and a jagged scar that traced down the side of his jaw like an old accusation. He wore a padded coat, black gloves, and boots too clean for a man who claimed to live off-grid. His expression shifted the moment he saw Kai. "You," he muttered. "You were supposed to be dead." Kai's snarl was more than animal. It was a reckoning. Ellis tackled Reed to the ground, Maggie covering Callie while Kai pinned the man with one paw, teeth bared. "You starved them," Ellis growled. "You broke them." "I made them better," Reed spat. "They were weapons. You don't mourn bullets when they jam." But he flinched when Kai growled low and deep, pressing a paw into his chest. Ellis stood, breathing hard. "You left Delta in a shed to die. You erased Kai like he was nothing." Reed didn't deny it. From outside, tires crunched on gravel. "Who's that?" Maggie whispered, gun drawn again. Nolan stepped forward, trembling. He reached for the radio, lifted it to his lips, and for the second time in his life, used his voice. "This is Nolan Briggs," he said, steady and clear. "We need help. Send state police, cabin at Maple Ridge Trail. Reed's here. They've got children." Silence, then static. Then, "Copy that, Nolan," a woman's voice crackled through. "Officers en route. Hold position." The storm outside began to fade. Within minutes, red and blue lights flashed through the trees. State troopers poured into the clearing, cuffed Reed, and took statements. Callie wrapped herself in a warm blanket, still clinging to Kai. Nolan sat by the fire they built outside, staring at the flames, his hands calm for once. A young officer knelt beside him. "You did good, kid." Nolan didn't speak, but he smiled. Hours later, as dawn crept over the mountain and painted the snow in pale gold, Ellis sat beside Callie and Kai in the back of the paramedic van. "You're safe now," he said. "No," Callie whispered, her face buried in Kai's neck. "We're home." The snow melted slowly in Maple Hollow that year, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let go of the long, dark winter. But melt it did. By March, the pines shimmered with dew instead of frost, and the frozen silence gave way to the rustle of new leaves and the cautious return of birdsong. Life crept back into the soil, and with it, a town once fractured by shadows began to find its shape again. Reed was gone, arrested, along with 3 former K-9 program administrators and 2 state-level accomplices who had funded the illicit operation through black market research contracts. The charges stacked against them, abuse, conspiracy, destruction of evidence, were staggering. And at the center of it all stood Kai, not merely as a victim, but as the key witness to a legacy of pain. A new kind of courtroom testimony had begun. behavioral experts and canine handlers interpreting Kai's responses, matching them with video fragments recovered from hidden surveillance in the ruined Station 9 compound. His reactions to commands, scents, and old audio clips became data points, not only in the conviction of Reed, but in the systemic investigation that followed. And through it all, Callie never left his side. She had changed too. The girl who had arrived with frozen cheeks and a rabbit plush clutched like armor now walked into town with her head high and Kai trotting beside her in a therapy vest. She wore yellow often now, and the small scar near her temple from the creek accident had healed into a faint crescent, like the moon never left her. Ellis, meanwhile, had filled out the last of the papers. It took weeks, court visits, and a stack of background checks, but the result was simple and final. Callie Heron was no longer just a guest in his home. She was his granddaughter in full legal right, his family not just in blood, but by choice. The morning the adoption was finalized, they stood together at the edge of Maple Hollow's Central Park. A modest garden had been planted in the center, soft tulips opening in careful clusters, and beside it stood a small building of cedar and glass. Kai's stand. The building, no larger than a schoolroom, was a tribute designed by the town council and funded through donations from across the country. Its interior held photographs, old uniforms, collars recovered from the Station 9 site, and a timeline tracing the legacy of working dogs in America, ending with a mural of Kai, painted by local artist Joanna Reyes. Joanna was in her early 30s, wiry, always speckled with paint, and rarely seen without a sketch pad in hand. Her own father had served in the fire department with Ellis years ago, and she volunteered to create the mural the moment she heard Kai's story. The mural was breathtaking. Kai depicted not in pain or fear, but in motion, surrounded by ghostly silhouettes of other dogs. Their eyes were closed, but they seemed to lean toward him, drawn by something eternal. Nolan Briggs visited every week. The boy, now attending school daily, had found his voice in pencils and color. Though he still rarely spoke aloud, his drawings had started to appear on classroom walls and library boards. Storyboards that told the tale of Kai's rescue and redemption. His latest piece showed a figure that looked like Callie, walking side by side with a golden German shepherd beneath a sky of blue fireflies. Lucian Blake stood at the back of the crowd that day, watching quietly. He wore a pressed blazer now, though it didn't quite suit him. The scars around his eyes remained, but his posture had shifted, from guarded to present. He had returned to his job, this time as an official investigator for an animal protection task force formed after the trial. His name no longer appeared only on the bylines of fringe reports. It now sat on federal briefings and televised panels. Still, he visited Maple Hollow monthly, each time leaving a white flower at the foot of Kai's stand. And Maggie's world had changed too. Her memoir, The Dog Who Remembered, released 6 weeks after Reed's conviction, became an unexpected national phenomenon. More than a recounting of events, it was a lyrical reflection on trauma, resilience, and the quiet defiance of a little girl and her broken dog. Within 2 months, it topped the New York Times bestseller list. Within 4, it was being adapted for film. Yet Maggie still lived in Maple Hollow, in the guest house behind Ellis's cabin. She refused interviews that required more than one flight and declined invitations from talk shows unless they allowed Callie and Kai to join. She'd grown softer in some ways, more sure in others. On clear mornings, she liked to sit on the porch with her coffee, notebook open, scribbling sentences that didn't need to be published. On the first true day of spring, Callie stood in front of her school auditorium. It was career day, and students had brought their parents or guardians to speak. Callie didn't bring Ellis, she brought Kai. She spoke clearly, her voice strong in the microphone. "This is Kai," she said. "He used to be trained to find people. Then some people hurt him. But he remembered how to love. And now he helps others who are scared, like I used to be." The room was silent. Then Nolan stood up from the front row. He held up a picture, a sketch of Callie and Kai surrounded by stars. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. The applause said everything. That afternoon, Ellis found a letter in the mailbox. It was from Jensen, the retired officer who had once worked under Reed and now lived quietly in Montana. Inside was a photo, Reed in cuffs, flanked by federal agents, and Kai watching from a short distance, his head held high. On the back of the photo were just 4 words: "He made it home." Later that day, Callie asked Ellis a question as they watched Kai rest in the sun-drenched yard. "Do you think the others, the ones who didn't make it, they know?" Ellis paused. "Know what, kiddo?" "That we remember them." He looked down at her, then at the dog now softly snoring beneath the lilac bush. "I think they do," he said. And as the breeze moved through the garden, stirring the petals of new tulips and the silent memory of all that had come before, Kai stirred in his sleep. His ears twitched, and for a moment, it looked like he was smiling. Some say it was just luck, a little girl who happened to spot a dog in the snow. But maybe it was something more. Maybe it was grace, a divine whisper in the wind, nudging one fragile soul toward another. Callie didn't have strength. Kai didn't have hope. Yet together, they found a path through darkness, lit by something no one could see, but many of us still believe in. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles come quietly. In a child's courage, in a dog's loyalty, in a stranger's choice to care. So, if you've ever doubted your voice matters, if you've ever prayed for a sign, this is it. May God bless you for watching, for caring, and for believing. Leave a comment if this story touched your heart. Subscribe to our channel to witness more stories of love and quiet bravery. And may the Lord continue to guide your path, just like he guided Callie to Kai.